November 3, 1964, 6:47 a.m. Detective Raymond Walsh stood in the back room of a closed butcher shop on 147th Street, staring at the industrial freezer that had been left running overnight despite the business being closed for 3 days. The temperature inside was negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The body inside was frozen solid, preserved in the exact position it had been placed, sitting upright, hands folded in lap, eyes open, with a single bullet wound through the center of the forehead. The victim was identified within hours as Thomas "Tommy" Hooks Richardson, 41 years old, who had worked as Bumpy Johnson's primary financial manager for the past 7 years, and who had vanished approximately 12 hours earlier on the evening of November 2nd. What made this murder different from the dozens of organized crime killings Walsh had investigated over his 20-year career was the specific staging of the body and the message that staging conveyed. This was not a disposal meant to hide evidence. This was a display meant to communicate something to very specific audiences. And what Detective Walsh did not yet understand, what he would only piece together after weeks of investigation that would ultimately go nowhere, was that Tommy Hooks Richardson had committed the one unforgivable act in Bumpy Johnson's world. He had stolen money from the organization and had attempted to frame another member for the theft. The 12 hours between his disappearance and the discovery of his body represented not random timing, but a carefully calculated period during which Bumpy had conducted a trial, extracted a confession, executed a sentence, and arranged the discovery in ways that would send unmistakable messages about loyalty, consequences, and the precision with which Bumpy Johnson administered justice within his organization. To understand the November 1964 betrayal and execution of Tommy Hooks Richardson, it is necessary to examine both his role in Bumpy's organization and the specific nature of the theft that triggered the response that would be the last major internal discipline action Bumpy would conduct before his death 4 years later. Tommy Hooks Richardson had been part of Bumpy's organization since 1957, initially working as a mid-level numbers runner before demonstrating unusual capability with financial record keeping and accounting that led to his promotion to increasingly responsible positions. By 1960, Richardson was managing the financial operations for several of Bumpy's gambling enterprises, handling cash receipts, maintaining records that tracked revenues and expenses, and preparing reports that allowed Bumpy to monitor profitability and identify problems. The position required both mathematical skill and absolute trustworthiness, because Richardson had access to large amounts of cash and had knowledge of the organization's financial structure that could be devastating if shared with law enforcement or rivals. Bumpy had selected Richardson for this role based on years of observation that suggested he was reliable, competent, and sufficiently loyal that the temptation to steal or betray would be manageable. The assessment was wrong. Beginning in mid-1963, Richardson began systematically stealing from the organization through a scheme that exploited his control over financial records and his understanding of how Bumpy's oversight functioned. The theft operated through falsification of expense reports and skimming of gambling receipts in ways that were individually small enough to avoid immediate detection, but that accumulated over time to substantial amounts. Richardson would report certain operational expenses as being higher than they actually were, pocketing the difference. He would underreport revenues from specific gambling operations, again keeping the difference. The scheme was sophisticated enough that it required detailed knowledge of the organization's operations and careful manipulation of records to maintain consistency across different reporting systems. Over approximately 15 months, from July 1963 through October 1964, Richardson stole an estimated $75,000 from Bumpy's organization. The theft would likely have continued indefinitely, except for a mistake Richardson made in October 1964, when discrepancies in financial records became large enough that they triggered Bumpy's attention during a routine review. When Bumpy questioned Richardson about the discrepancies, Richardson made the fatal decision to attempt covering his theft by framing another member of the organization, a man named James Carter who worked as a collections supervisor and who had some access to the same financial operations Richardson controlled. Richardson claimed that he had noticed irregularities in Carter's collections and suspected Carter was skimming, providing fabricated evidence that he had prepared in advance to make the accusation appear credible. Bumpy's response to Richardson's accusation against Carter was to conduct a thorough investigation before taking any action, a pattern consistent with how he had always operated when internal discipline issues arose. Rather than immediately accepting Richardson's claims or immediately confronting Carter, Bumpy activated his internal security apparatus to examine the financial records in detail, to interview people who worked with both Richardson and Carter, and to trace the actual flow of money through the organization's operations. The investigation took approximately 2 weeks and was conducted with sufficient discretion that neither Richardson nor Carter was aware of its scope or findings until Bumpy was ready to act on the results. The investigation confirmed what Bumpy had begun to suspect, that Richardson was the thief and that his accusation against Carter was an attempted deflection. The evidence was comprehensive. Financial records showed patterns of manipulation that only Richardson had the access and knowledge to execute. Witnesses who had worked with Richardson described suspicious behaviors, including late-night work sessions, where he was alone with records, and unexplained affluence that exceeded what his salary from the organization would support. Most conclusively, investigators found hidden records that Richardson had maintained for his own purposes, documenting the actual amounts he had stolen and the methods he had used to conceal the theft. These records had been kept by Richardson as insurance in case he needed to prove that he had not stolen more than he actually had, but they became the evidence that definitively proved his guilt. On November 2, 1964, Bumpy had assembled complete documentation of Richardson's theft and his attempted frame-up of Carter. The decision Bumpy faced was how to respond in ways that would address multiple objectives simultaneously. Richardson needed to be punished for the theft, but more importantly for the betrayal of trust and for the attempt to destroy an innocent member of the organization. Carter needed to be vindicated and compensated for the suspicion he had been subjected to even though the investigation had not yet become public. The organization needed to see that internal theft and betrayal carried consequences severe enough to deter others from similar actions. And the broader criminal community needed to understand that Bumpy's organization maintained discipline and loyalty that made it more stable and reliable than less well-managed operations. The plan Bumpy developed addressed all these objectives through a sequence of actions that would unfold over approximately 12 hours on November 2nd and early November 3rd. Richardson would be summoned to a meeting under the pretense of discussing the Carter investigation and would be confronted with evidence of his own guilt. He would be given opportunity to confess and explain his actions, both to determine if there were mitigating circumstances and to extract information about whether anyone else was involved in the theft or the frame-up attempt. Based on the confession and Bumpy's judgment about Richardson's motivations and character, a sentence would be determined and executed. Finally, Richardson's body would be discovered in circumstances that would communicate specific messages to different audiences while minimizing Bumpy's legal exposure. The meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. on November 2nd at a location Bumpy controlled, the back office of a legitimate business that provided privacy and security. Richardson arrived believing he was going to provide additional information about Carter's suspected theft. Instead, he found Bumpy, several senior members of the organization, and James Carter himself. The presence of Carter immediately signaled to Richardson that something had gone wrong with his plan. Bumpy spoke first, laying out the evidence of Richardson's theft, an attempted frame-up with the same methodical precision that characterized all his strategic planning. Financial records were presented showing the manipulations Richardson had made. Witnesses testified about Richardson's suspicious behaviors. The hidden records Richardson had kept were produced, demonstrating that Richardson had documented his own crimes in ways that left no doubt about his guilt. Richardson's response was an attempt at continued deception, claiming the records were fake or that he had been forced to participate in someone else's scheme. When this failed to produce credible explanations for the evidence against him, Richardson shifted to pleading for mercy based on his years of service and on family obligations that would be disrupted if he was killed. Bumpy listened to these pleas without visible reaction, then explained why they were insufficient. The theft of $75,000, while significant, was not the primary offense. Organizations could absorb financial losses if they were acknowledged and addressed honestly. The unforgivable act was the betrayal of trust and the attempt to destroy an innocent member rather than accepting responsibility for his own actions. Richardson had not just stolen money. He had tried to have James Carter killed or permanently exiled from the organization through false accusations, which would have destroyed Carter's life while allowing Richardson to continue his theft indefinitely. The sentence Bumpy imposed was death, to be executed immediately. The decision was based on both the severity of the betrayal and on the deterrent value of demonstrating that certain actions carried non-negotiable consequences. However, the method of execution and the subsequent disposal of the body were calculated to send specific messages rather than simply eliminating Richardson efficiently. Richardson was shot once in the forehead at approximately 9:30 p.m. on November 2nd, a method that was quick and that minimized suffering while also being symbolic. The forehead shot represented judgment and execution rather than crime of passion violence. The body was then transported to the butcher shop on 147th Street, a business that had recently closed and that Bumpy's organization had access to through various connections. The decision to place Richardson's body in the freezer rather than disposing of it in ways that would prevent discovery reflected Bumpy's calculation about the messages he wanted to send. The freezer served multiple symbolic purposes. It preserved the body in perfect condition, ensuring that when it was discovered the cause of death, and the staging would be immediately apparent. It represented cold calculation and premeditation rather than hot-blooded revenge. It was located in a butcher shop, creating an implicit parallel between Richardson's fate and the processing of meat. He had been judged, executed, and prepared for display with the same systematic efficiency that characterized commercial food preparation. The timing of the discovery, approximately 12 hours after Richardson's disappearance, was arranged by having someone anonymously contact police about a disturbance at the butcher shop, ensuring that the body would be found quickly enough that the staging would be understood as intentional rather than as random disposal. Detective Walsh's investigation into Richardson's murder followed standard procedures, but encountered the complete lack of cooperation that characterized most organized crime investigations in Harlem. No witnesses could be found who had seen Richardson on the evening of November 2nd. The butcher shop had been closed for days, and no one could explain how Richardson's body had been placed there or who had access to the location. The anonymous tip that led to the discovery could not be traced. The single bullet that killed Richardson was from a common caliber weapon that could not be definitively linked to any specific firearm. Within 2 weeks, the investigation had stalled completely, and while detectives suspected Bumpy Johnson's involvement based on Richardson's known association with his organization, there was no evidence that would support prosecution. The internal impact of Richardson's execution on Bumpy's organization was significant and multifaceted. The discovery of the theft and the frame-up attempt had created shock and anger among members who had worked with Richardson and who felt betrayed by someone they had trusted. The thorough investigation Bumpy conducted before acting demonstrated that accusations would be taken seriously and that evidence would be required before punishment was imposed, which provided some protection against false accusations. The execution itself sent unmistakable message that betrayal carried fatal consequences regardless of how long someone had been part of the organization or what service they had previously provided. The specific staging of the body communicated that the execution was not impulsive revenge, but was calculated judgment administered by leadership that maintained control and discipline even when dealing with internal threats. James Carter, the man Richardson had attempted to frame, was publicly vindicated and was compensated both financially and through promotion to a more senior position that recognized the injustice he had suffered and that demonstrated Bumpy's commitment to protecting innocent members of the organization. This outcome was important for maintaining organizational morale and for ensuring that members understood they would not be arbitrarily sacrificed if they were falsely accused. The compensation Carter received included a portion of the money Richardson had stolen that was recovered through seizure of Richardson's assets, creating a direct connection between the theft, the punishment, and the restitution that made the justice feel complete rather than purely punitive. The external impact of Richardson's execution on the broader criminal community was primarily about reinforcing Bumpy Johnson's reputation for maintaining discipline and for responding to internal problems with precision, rather than with the kind of chaotic violence that characterized less sophisticated operations. The story of how Richardson was caught, tried, executed, and displayed spread through organized crime networks as an example of how professional organizations handled betrayal. The 12-hour timeframe between disappearance and discovery became part of the legend, suggesting that Bumpy's organization operated with efficiency and planning that allowed them to conduct investigations, reach conclusions, and implement consequences faster than most criminal operators could manage. The freezer staging became a signature element of the story, remembered and repeated because of its symbolic weight, and because it demonstrated attention to messaging that went beyond simply killing someone who had become a problem. For law enforcement, the Richardson case became another example of the limitations they faced when investigating organized crime in communities where cooperation with police was viewed as dangerous, and where criminal organizations had sufficient discipline that members would not provide information, even when offered significant incentives. Detective Walsh's investigation file included extensive documentation of what had probably happened, that Richardson had stolen from Bumpy's organization, that he had been caught and executed, that the body had been staged to send messages, but included almost no admissible evidence that would support criminal charges against anyone involved. The case remained officially unsolved, though unofficially everyone involved understood exactly what had occurred and why. The Tommy Hooks Richardson execution in November 1964 was the last major internal discipline action Bumpy Johnson would personally oversee before his death in 1968. In the final 4 years of his life, Bumpy's organization continued to function with the loyalty and discipline that the Richardson case had reinforced, and no similar betrayals occurred that required comparable responses. Whether this was because potential betrayers were deterred by Richardson's fate, or because Bumpy's vetting and oversight became more effective after discovering how Richardson had operated undetected for 15 months is unclear. What is clear is that the incident established or reinforced several principles that characterized how Bumpy's organization functioned: that theft and betrayal would be punished severely, that investigations would be thorough before action was taken, that innocent members would be protected and compensated if they were falsely accused, and that executions would be conducted with sufficient planning and symbolism to maximize their deterrent and communicative effects. Understanding the Richardson case requires recognizing that it was not primarily about the $75,000 that was stolen, though that amount was significant. It was about trust, loyalty, and the attempt to destroy an innocent person to cover a crime. These violations went to the core of what made Bumpy's organization functional and sustainable over decades, despite facing threats from law enforcement, rival criminals, and internal challenges. Organizations that could not maintain internal loyalty and that could not protect members from false accusations would fragment and collapse under pressure. Bumpy's response to Richardson's betrayal demonstrated that these principles would be enforced regardless of how long someone had been part of the organization or what contributions they had made in the past. The message was clear. Loyalty was not negotiable, betrayal was unforgivable, and consequences would be administered with the same precision and calculation that characterized every other aspect of how Bumpy Johnson operated. The specific detail of finding Richardson's body in a freezer 12 hours after his disappearance became one of the most remembered elements of Bumpy Johnson's legacy, told and retold as an example of his approach to justice and discipline. The story contained elements that made it memorable: the dramatic discovery, the symbolic staging, the compressed timeframe that suggested extraordinary efficiency, the cold-blooded precision that characterized both the execution and its aftermath. Whether all details of the story as it was told in subsequent years were completely accurate is less important than what the story represented about how Bumpy's organization functioned, and how Bumpy thought about power, discipline, and the administration of consequences for violations of trust. The Richardson case stood as a final demonstration of the principles Bumpy had operated according to throughout his career, principles that had allowed him to build and maintain an organization that survived for decades in an environment where most criminal enterprises collapsed quickly under internal or external pressures.